Hello, everybody. Good evening to everyone, and welcome to the Pennsylvania Earth Sciences Association and PISA Presents. This evening, we're going to be taking a look into soaring with the world of the flying reptiles. So let's just glide on in or flap on in, whichever method you prefer, and let's go visit some of our new friends. So now you may be wondering, when did independent flight first evolve? Well, that answer would be about 350 to 400 million years ago with the insects. Now, the flying reptiles didn't really come about until the Mesozoic, with them themselves kind of perking out about roughly, say, 220 or so million years ago. Now, what happens in between and a little bit fore and aft gets kind of complicated, but is relevant to the situation. So now reptiles first evolved about roughly 310, 320 million years ago. Now, if you can think of things as a family tree for reptiles, the branch that led to today's reptiles, say like snakes, just an example, with that absolutely, I love snakes, that absolutely adorable snake right there. I mean, isn't it so cute? I could just pinch it. It's adorable. That branched off about 250 million years ago. And then you kept going up, and whatever common ancestor the today's birds, which of course include the reptiles that are the dinosaurs, and the flying reptiles, sorry, whatever common ancestors they have, which people can't really agree on, those two diverged about 200 million years ago. So reptiles first came about 310, 320 million years ago. That line continued. Modern day reptiles branched off 250 million years ago. The lines of reptiles branched again about 200 plus million years ago to the modern day lineages. Now, those said flying reptiles are a group known as Pterosauria. Now, their origins are very nebulous at best. Where they came from, when, people don't really know exactly. That fellow right there is called Lagerpeton. Folks aren't really sure where the pterosaurs, as what I'll call them henceforth, or the flying reptiles, people don't really know exactly when they came from and like how they evolved. It's something that's very much up to disagreement now in the literature. So it's not really something that I'm going to focus on because there's about a solid dozen prevailing theories right now. So just keep in mind that if you read and say a piece of literature that so and so person says for sure this is how they evolved, that's not really true. People don't really know how they evolved. It's not set in stone for sure. Now, how and why don't really people know a lot of early pterosaur history? Well, in part of it is because that, well, yes, they only came about at a relatively recent time during the Mesozoic. So early Mesozoic, that would of course be the Triassic. So again, still 220 million years ago. That's not really that long ago when you think about how old the Earth is, right? Still, their skeletons aren't really built for preservation. Fossilization is a very, very tough process on a specimen, on a physical body. And pterosaur skeletons are, if you look at this specimen right there. Now, I specifically picked this because this is the second biggest species right here. This one is actually called Quetzalcoatlus. Now, this one right here, this one is about 35-foot long wingspan. And you look at it, and you can still tell if you look at the wing bones, it's still pretty. The term that osteologists and paleontologists use is gracile. The bones are very delicate, they're very slender. When you have very delicate, slender bones like that, it's hard for these specimens to preserve. It's hard for them to keep fossilized. And so even with not that much time really, it's difficult for these specimens to survive the rigorous processes of fossilization. It's too much against them really. It's a stacked deck is what it comes down to. Now, so again, so we have Pterosauria, And then those are subdivided into two different groups. You have your basal pterosaurs and your pterodactyloids. So the difference is basal pterosaurs are, I don't really want to say less complex, but in many ways they are. Overall, they're smaller. They tend to have less anatomical features that pterodactyloids are, and pterodactyloids also have more features linked to, say, things like sexual dimorphism as well. We're not going to really get into which when I talk into various species coming along the way, like which comes from which. It's not really relevant just for the purposes of having fun, but still, just so you know, it's divided into two different sections. Now, terms that you might hear when we talk about, and yes, that is wearing a Santa hat. There are lots of wonderful things that you can find are in public use images, one of which are pterosaurs wearing Santa hats. And you know what? Happy holidays, folks. Now, there are different ideas as to how these creatures evolved, one of which is trees down. So, possibly back in the day, however many millions of years ago, because the oldest specimens of pterosaurs that we have are what the Sorry, folks. My cat is outside my door right here and he is yowling to be let in and he is just not being quiet. So if you hear a cat screaming in the background, that's Chester. He's fine. I swear to God, I'm not starving my cat. He's just being moody. So anyways, so the trees down hypothesis is that you have these animals, these creatures that are hiding out in the trees doing their thing, but for whatever reason, say potentially a lack of resources, some people say a lack of water, for example, they're like, oh, that water down there in the ground, that looks pretty nice. I like that. I'm going to go down there. That looks really inviting. And so they wind up gliding, flying, whatever mechanism they use down there. And then conversely, the other idea, which is overall the more accepted hypothesis for pterosaur evolution, is ground up, which is you have these creatures running along on the ground, and they're, whether it be predation, other things, they're thinking, they're just kind of inching along, and they're like, oh crap. There's Bob. Bob tried to beat me up last week. I better get away from him. And then just ping, up he goes. So if you see the down or the up in the literature, that's basically what they mean. There's just the two prevailing theories as to how pterosaurs evolved. Now, of course, the main thing with them is the wing. So what are some of the features of their bodies and the wing, and how do they relate to these creatures as a whole? Well, first of all, the wing isn't necessarily a wing, but a really giant finger. It's actually an elongated fourth digit. Some people will call it a pinky, but it's the OCD, like anthropology major in me and geology. I don't like doing that because these animals don't have hands like we have hands. So to say that they have a pinky finger isn't really for me like biologically proper. So just say an elongated fourth digit. And really, if you look closely at the drawing, which is done very, very well, whoever illustrated this, it goes right out of the hand. It's literally, this is one of their fingers, is from which the membrane that composed the wing is constructed from. And then they have a keeled sternum. So their breastbone is keeled like a boat. And why is it keeled like that? Well, you need something that's very strong and tough and rigid so you can attach these very strong chest muscles to in order to, say, on the downstroke when they're able to propel themselves whichever direction they want to go to, you need very strong chest muscles to do that and very strong points of attachment. And then also too, conversely, you need a very strong upper arm. You need a very strong humerus. That doesn't mean that they're funny. Somebody at work was trying to convince me to work that joke into here, and I'm like, sorry, no. It just means that they have a very strong upper arm bone, which is something that they need to propel themselves in a downstroke in flight, and also too, conversely, in an upstroke. And at this part, I am going to duck underneath the flying torches and some of the comments that I may get. They were most likely warm-blooded. How do we know that? Well, first of all, pterosaurs are obviously reptiles. Modern day reptiles, yes. You're leading things into birds. Birds come from reptiles. So logically, because point A gradually leads into point C, all by it over several millions of years and quite a few jumps in evolution, you can reason that they were warm-blooded. Now, also, too, they bear several features, anatomically speaking, that make scientists think that they were warm blooded creatures. One of which is the simple fact that they bear a lot of anatomical features that, having having developed independent flight, they basically needed a certain metabolic structure. Basically, they needed that warm blooded structure in their system to be able to actually maintain that sustained flight. It needed to be that way in order for them to function in their environment. Also, too, they would have things like feather or hair-like wing fibers as well for insulation. Some species had tails. Later on, species and larger species didn't really have tails, possibly because they were more adept at turning. Also, too, they had what was called a pteroid bone, which was one that was very supportive on their hand. And then there was, I believe it was their hand. And then also, too, many species had a crest on their head. And then, of course, as well, like I said, warm-blooded. Now, just to get some names out there, so pterosaur versus pterodactyl versus pteranodon. So pterosauria is an order. It's so basically when certain things are classified, it's like kingdom, phylum, order, family, genus, species. Those are all different names for these various groups of organisms. Pterosauria is a name given to an order. Now, that particular order includes all pterosaurs, including members of a genus. So, genus is within an order, Pterodactylus and Pteranodon, which means that pterodactyls and pteranodons are pterosaurs. So, if it helps. Also, too, when I was a little kid, now this is going to sound really dorky, but keep in mind I was maybe 3 when I came up with this. When I was real, real little, I came up with the idea that pterosaurs were sore because they had pterodactyls and pteranodons fitting inside them. That was an idea that I came up with to make me remember that the two were basically categories within the other one. Now, this is just to give you an idea that pterosaurs really had like pretty much a near global fossil distribution. And you may be wondering, well, while yes, they were winged, why are so many of them in the middle of some of these continents? Well, keep in mind that the continents have changed place over time. There is this thing called continental drift. The continents are moving, they're changing shape gradually, positions over time. So while, say, North America is in that position right now, it has definitely not been in that position for the entire history of the Earth. So as these animals are flying about and over, and also too, various bodies of water have made certain things accessible, not accessible. So how you look at the land now has not always been how the land has looked, especially to a pterosaur in their time. Now, this is just a really quick look at just to give you the idea of a size of a person next to some of these various creatures that we're going to be taking a peek at very, very soon. Now, here are some of them. So we're just going to take a quick look at some famous species and a few that I just thought were really, really neat. So Cryodracon boreas. Now, this is in a two-way tie for the third biggest pterosaur. The other one is an unnamed one in Mongolia. So both of these guys have a wingspan of 33 foot long. But this one, I think, has the best name of any pterosaur. It means the icy cold dragon of the uppermost north, pretty much, which is absolutely awesome. The people that discovered it, they actually wanted to name it after one of the dragons in Game of Thrones, but they got allegedly overruled by the studio. Allegedly, there's a bit of like myth going on about that, so who knows with that stuff. Now, these are the two largest species, Now, the one on the right is actually from Transylvania. I was telling somebody at work about that today, and they're like, "You mean that place is real?" Yes, Transylvania is indeed real. It is not fictional. And on the left is, I mentioned that before, that's the second biggest one, Quetzalcoatlus. So these are the two largest pterosaurs. So you have wingspans of about 33 to 39 and 33 to 36 foot respectively, compared to a giraffe. So that just gives you an idea as to how big some of these creatures could really get. Now, this is Ikon Draco Avatar, who was named after the creature in the Avatar movies. The crest, instead of coming out of its head, it came out of its lower jaw instead. Now, you can just barely make out its head in that specimen, but I believe that's actually the type specimen from the Paleozoological Museum of China right there. Now, this thing is adorable. The reconstructions of this, it basically looks like a giant flying squirrel, like a giant fuzzy flying squirrel, like a cross between that and a bat. Really interesting. So it's tiny. It's only got like a 3 foot wingspan, and that's one of the neat things about pterosaurs is that now, so they were evolving, obviously, along with reptiles and along with birds. Like there are just these three completely, well, not completely, but these three very different in many ways and still very similar in many ways groups of organisms that were evolving and existing at the same time. And really, when they were achieving their greatest diversity, birds were achieving their greatest diversity too. And so you look at a little guy like this, he had all of these little pycnofibers, they're called. They fossilized, they look like little hairs, but they're actually not hairs, they're very specialized fibers. Now, this is Nyctosaurus gracilis. It's got almost like an antler, like a horn on the back of its head. Now, this is just a combination of several noted species. Dimorphodon is in the upper left. Now, Pterodactylus is in the upper right. Yes, Pterodactylus is its own species. And then there's our friend Quetzalcoatlus in the center right again. And then three more actually. Now, this one is often compared to actually a giant flamingo. It used the bottom part of its jaw to strain out food and water. So there's kind of like the overall illustration and then the close-up illustration. Now, this is Pteranodon longiceps, probably the most famous pteranodon. This is in the American Museum of Natural History in New York. It's an absolutely beautiful specimen, wonderfully mounted. I always love seeing this whenever I go there. This is Rhamphorhynchus. This is probably one of my favorite of all the flying reptiles. I just love it because of its little tiny tail fin. It is so cute. It's so adorable. And I love the Vietnamese stamp down there at the lower right. It's why can't I get stamps like that? It's like whenever I go to the post office, they just give me a choice of like flowers to choose between. I want a Rhamphorhynchus stamp, darn it. Now, this is great. I mean, like Death Dragon, that's awesome. So apparently, like, yeah, I mean, I wish I could name fossils like that. That would be great. That is what that means, by the way. Now, this is, oops, that got out of alphabetical order, definitely. So this is a species out of Brazil. And thank you very much, folks, for joining us today. And hope you have a lovely rest of your day and a lovely week. Thank you kindly for joining us again. Now go out there and find yourself some more